Okay, good evening. If you could, please find your seats. If you'd like some water or tea or coffee with a light dessert, feel free to help yourself in the back of the room. We'll try to keep this as casual as possible, but we do have two great speakers with us this evening, and I'll introduce them here shortly. Welcome to ASU. For those of you that are newcomers, I know there's a lot of cadets out, and I do appreciate your support for coming to this important discussion. And welcome to the Davidson Conference Room. On behalf of the Center for Security Studies and the 17th Training Wing, I'd like to welcome you all to this discussion on ISIS, or tackling ISIS, and looking at the Dabiq and various other associated propaganda aspects and other important aspects that our speakers will identify tonight. As a courtesy, if you would, please silence your cell phones or other electronic devices. I know sometimes that can be disruptive not only to the speaker but to the audience as well, so I appreciate that. We're also recording tonight's presentation for those that can't be here. As many of you know, at ASU we have a lot of online courses, and this is going to be very beneficial to a lot of our security studies programs that we have here at the undergraduate and graduate level. And I'm Dr. Randy Mullis. It's my privilege to welcome our speakers tonight. I'm the chair of the Department of Security Studies and Criminal Justice, and again, very pleased to introduce Dr. Jaha Michaud, Dr. Tony Celso, and our moderator, Dr. Bruce Bechtel. Dr. Celso will be our first speaker, and it sometimes pains me to say this, but he's from the Ohio State University, or that's where he received his PhD. So we like to welcome Tony tonight. I had the privilege to meet him a little bit earlier today, but I've been in the department about 3 months, so I'm looking forward to this, to hear Tony's presentation and his perspective on these important issues. He was appointed professor in 2016 and has previously served as an assistant professor since 2011. He's previously taught at Central Florida as well as Valley Forge Military College. He's written numerous books and articles, as has Dr. Michaud, on topics that are quite relevant to today's security environment. Of these, and you'll notice these in your program, is the crisis of the African state in the 21st century, globalization, tribalism, and jihadism. Others include Al-Qaeda's post-9/11 devolution, the failed jihadist struggle against the near and far enemy, and defeating the Islamic State, crafting a rational war strategy, which is very appealing to me for other reasons. And lastly, the caliphate in the digital age, the Islamic State's challenge to the liberal global order. So Tony, glad to have you here with us tonight. Our other speaker is Dr. Michaud. He is professor of Islamic thought and Christian-Muslim relations and co-editor of the Muslim World Journal, which after I got to meet Professor Michaud last night, I Googled it. There's some interesting stuff in there. Okay, he mentioned last night that they're doing some comparative studies or issues, and one, for example, is the Protestant Reformation and Islam. So I found that one particularly interesting, but there are others as well. Dr. Michaud joined the Hartford Seminary in 2008. Previously, from 1983 to 97, he taught Arabic philosophy, language, history, and literature in Louvain, Belgium, which, as he knows, and I know a little bit of, is a fascinating history in and of itself. He's also taught at Oxford. Many of you probably heard of that, until 2008, where he then proceeded to Hartford, Connecticut. He's the author of Ibn Sina, Lettres au Vizir Abu Saoud, pardon my pronunciations as I go through these, Avicenne, Réfutation de la Stratégie, Ahmad al-Hasiri, and Musulmans en Europe. He's published much more. If you Google his full CV, it will take you a while, as it would with Tony's, to go through his entire academic career. He is internationally recognized and a specialist of the Iranian philosopher Avicenna and the Syrian theologian / Mufti Ibn Taymiyyah. I look forward to his talk, as I do with Dr. Celso, and he will follow him. Dr. Bruce Bechtel, also of Angelo State University, will be our moderator once we get to the Q&A session. He received his PhD from the Union Institute in Cincinnati, Ohio, in National Security Studies. Bruce, as many of you probably know, is our Korean expert. So if anyone has a question in Korean, Bruce will happily engage that one. Otherwise, we'll leave it to our experts tonight. Bruce has also taught at the Marine Corps University as well as the Air Command and Staff College, which is where we got to know each other, both as colleagues and as friends. Bruce, as we all also know, or at least in the department, has produced quite extensively on North Korea. And I'm going to take a quick opportunity to put a plug in for an upcoming event. Another symposium, this one's on North Korea threats and challenges. It will be held on the 29th of November in Rassman. So for you RTC guys, you're close, okay, to this one. It's free and open to the public. It'll take place at 5 o'clock, and the speakers are quite impressive for that particular event, which is co-hosted, I think, by the Korea Economic Institute. So another thing to look forward to at the end of the month. When we get to the Q&A session, I would ask that you would keep your questions focused and relevant to the topic tonight to allow everybody that wants to ask a question to have that opportunity. And Dr. Brechtel is very strict at moderating, so I'm sure we will take care of that. But before I forget, and I do this a lot, and when you get older, you'll understand that, I want to give a special thanks to the 17th Training Group at Goodfellow, to Chaplain AJ, as we refer to him. I've been practicing your name, but we'll go with AJ today. Also to the ASU UC staff and for the audiovisual support that we're getting tonight, as well as the ushers from DET 847, who are also going to serve as mic handlers. So thanks to you guys for being here. And of course, the Center for Security Studies and the department. And as a quick transition, as Dr. Celso prepares to come up, is in our discussions with Dr. Michaud about Avicenna, which I knew very little about, but now I'm very intrigued. Like many great philosophers, there's a lot of quotable quotes associated with them. And I found one that I think, at least I hope, will have some meaning for us tonight as we look at ISIS and the Dabiq and other things associated with that movement. And the quote is basically, the knowledge of anything, since all things have causes, is not acquired or complete unless it is known by its causes. So something to ponder as we get into this very complex issue, looking at ISIS, and particularly from an American perspective, so what is the threat? And with that, Dr. Celso, I will turn the podium over to you and look forward to an enlightening evening as we look at this important and relevant topic.
Welcome. I want to thank you for having me talk on ISIS and ISIS ideology. And the focus of my presentation today is the Islamic State threat to Western homeland security. And I'm going to try to personify it by looking at the life history and ideas of a person that I consider to be the most influential in the development of ISIS propaganda, and most particularly the development of external operations that have promoted a spate of attacks across the West. And his name is Abu Muhammad al-Adnani. Now, Adnani's dead. He was killed in an American drone strike in May of 2016. But his legacy continues, and we'll see how. There's a picture of Adnani himself. There are very few images of Adnani, and despite the paucity of his public appearances, I mean, these guys don't really make too many public appearances for good reason, he was the very vocal propagandist of the movement. He was very prolific in his statements and his diatribes, and he was a master polemicist. He used very provocative, incendiary language to goad ISIS supporters into attacking the Western homeland. A few biographical details associated with Adnani. Now, if you take a look at the inner core of the ISIS hierarchy, as it was developing in 2011, 2012, 2013, it is a predominantly Iraqi organization. The Shura Council, the top commanders, all Iraqi. One exception, Adnani, Syrian. Now, the significance of this is that the Islamic State claims to have formed a transnational jihadi state. It is claimed to have restored the caliphate, something that had not occurred in the Muslim world since the Ottoman Empire unraveled. And like Baghdadi as well, he is a religious student. And Adnani plays a very, very important role in the spread of ISIS's network in Syria. as a consequence of the chaos of the Syrian civil war. And so when ISIS forces link up at the Iraqi-Syrian border, they essentially abrogate colonial-era territories. Hence, the restoration of the caliphate, and it is Adani, not the current emir of the Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, that makes the proclamation that the caliphate has been restored. The significance of Adani being a religious student is that it belies an ongoing myth that the Islamic State is nothing more than a front organization for ex-Baathists. Now, if you took a look at the top person and the second in command, they're both committed Islamists. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has a PhD in Islamic studies, and Adani, his religious devotion and piety was so impressive that it facilitated his upward ascendance in the ranks of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then its successor, Islamic State of Iraq. And so I don't think there's any question that this is a fundamentalist extremist movement and not simply just a shell movement for Baathists. He traveled to Iraq after the US invasion in 2003, and he rose through the ranks of AQI and its successor, the Islamic State of Iraq, and so impressed al-Baghdadi with his religious piety and knowledge of the Quran that Baghdadi made him second in command. So what is this guy's importance and why do I go on about him? Well, he was a master polemicist, a brilliant propagandist. He had an unequaled capacity to agitate and incite ISIS supporters. He played a critical role in the development of ISIS's media infrastructure and apparatus. If you take a look at ISIS, it has numerous production companies. It has magazines in multiple languages, including Arabic, English, Russian, Turkish, and French. He plays a critical role in organizing the various execution videos that are filmed in Hollywood-esque grotesque fashion. The stonings, the immolations, the crucifixions, the beheadings. Most of all, he is a pivotal actor in the development of ISIS's external operation branches. Its terrorism outside the Iraq-Syrian base that have killed thousands of people, wounded tens of thousands, and has taken a strong position in terms of attacking the West, right? But most of all, including the mortifying November 13th, 2015 attacks in Paris that killed 130 people. It was Adani that supervised their training and selected the assassins. But most of all, as a propagandist, there was the active use of social media, often covered by encrypted technology, to encourage ISIS supporters to travel to their state, to defend the Islamic State from its enemies, or, barring travel, to kill people in their own native lands. All right, I want to talk about Dabiq and Rumiyah. If you're really interested in either publication, you can go to the Clarion Project, and they have all of the issues of Dabiq and Rumiyah. Now, one of the things that makes the Islamic State a distinctive jihadi movement, far more distinctive than al-Qaeda, from which it evolves, is its apocalyptic orientation, its emphasis on Islamic eschatology, the end times, the Armageddon. And that is a very rare phenomenon in the jihadi world. You'd have to go back to the apocalyptic cult in 1979 that stormed the Grand Mosque of Mecca. Even before that, the Mahdist revolution in the Sudan. Now, both Rumiyah and Dabiq have this kind of apocalyptic orientation. Dabiq is named after a Syrian town that was rumored to be the site of a future battle between Muslim and Christian armies, in which that would invite the Armageddon and the ultimate victory of Islam against its enemies. And it was rumored that the Prophet Muhammad had talked about Dabiq. There's an oral tradition, a prophetic oral tradition called Hadith. And if you take, and Dabiq itself was under Islamic State occupation. It fell in 2016. And so there are about 16 issues of Dabiq. It becomes very problematic to continue to publish Dabiq given the fact that the town of Dabiq fell to the Islamic State's enemies. And so after some discussion, they decided to publish a new magazine in English, Rumiyah, that also has this Islamic apocalyptic component. Rumiyah, it alludes to Rome and the Islamic conquest of Rome. Now, whether it is Dabiq or Rumiyah, if you take a look at the structure of both magazines, enemies are vilified, martyrs are mythologized. There is an emphasis on end times battles. There are technical manuals for the development of bombs, vehicle attacks, and knives, all sorts of practical know-how to encourage lone wolves and homegrown terrorists to kill Westerners by any means possible. Here are some issues of Dabiq. The first issue of Dabiq, the return of the Khalifa, the return of the Caliphate. Adani really begins the first issue of the return of the Khalifa with his famous June 2014 restoration of the Caliphate. It is Adani, not Baghdadi, that announces the restoration of the Caliphate. The first issue of Rumiyah is after Adani's death. It mythologizes him as a martyr. And one of the significant consequences of Adani's killing is that the production values of ISIS propaganda declined precipitously. This is a picture of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. This is his only public appearance. This is Caliph Ibrahim, the emir of the Islamic State. This is a famous shot of his address in the Grand Mosque of Mosul in July of 2014, where he audaciously demanded the loyalty of Muslims across the globe and demanded their hijrah, or emigration, to the Islamic State to fight for the movement. Obviously, most Muslims rejected these entreaties. In fact, 300 leading clerics, Muslim clerics, repudiated Baghdadi's proclamation of the Caliphate and repudiated his view of Islam. Next slide. One of the reasons that I emphasize Adnani is I see him as the voice of contemporary jihadism. A jihadism that for over a generation has progressively radicalized, that is based on three fundamental principles. The first principle, al-wala wal-bara, the doctrine of loyalty and renunciation. Takfir, excommunication of co-religionists. And jihad, envisioned as a doctrine of aggressive warfare against Muslim apostates and virtually every civilization in the world. Jihad is then elevated as a sixth pillar of Islam. And what I'm going to be arguing in subsequent slides is that these various principles have progressively become more extreme. And so we'll deal first with the doctrine of loyalty and renunciation. It speaks to a kind of narrow community of authentic believers that's ascribed to a vision of Islam rooted in the medieval age, in which what they envision to be the type of Islam as practiced by the Prophet Muhammad and his so-called four righteous successors. And I'll just read it to you because I think it is emblematic of a paranoid, isolated personality that has an enormous sectarian hostility toward the Shia. The whole world has not come together to wage war against us except because we command the worship of Allah, Alone without partner, we incur others to do so. We make wallah based upon it, and we declare the disbelief of those who abandon it. We warn of shirk, polytheism, in the worship of Allah, and we are severe against it. We make enemies based upon it, and we declare the disbelief of those who engage in it. This is our call, this is our religion. For this alone, we fight the world, and they fight us. And so what emerges is a paranoid personality in which the whole world has come to wage war against an authentic community of believers. All right? Next slide. I'm going to deal with the doctrine of loyalty and renunciation of wala wal bara. All right? This is a fundamental principle of the jihadist movement. It deals with, as I indicated, a narrow community of authentic believers surrounded in a sea of apostasy that struggle against the sickness and depravity that they believe has been inflicted upon the Muslim world. They are passionate critics of theological innovations over time that are not rooted in Quran or in oral traditions associated with the Prophet Muhammad. They see external influences over time, Greco-Roman influences, Persian influences, the ideas of the European Enlightenment have corrupted and degraded the practice of Islam, altering the religion from its divine trajectory. The end result of these foreign influences and these theological heresies is the collapse of the Ottomans, the end of the Caliphate, and European colonization of the Mideast. This needs to be reversed. This apostasy, this corruption needs to be eviscerated, and the Caliphate needs to be restored. Oop. The Islamic State is principally a Sunni extremist organization. It has a very narrow conception as to whom are authentic believers. Yet again, another statement from Adani. Oh, our people, the Sunnis. Oh, you, the tribes of good. You have tried all regimes, and you have witnessed the treachery of all those parties and those failing perverted groups. You are invited to join hands with your sons, the Mujahideen, to form a solid front against the Crusader Rafidi plots and the Magi-Iranian expansion in Mesopotamia and all Muslim lands, so as to restore your Islamic caliphate. Now, the significance of this quote is that the Crusaders, the Jews, the Western powers, have joined forces with Shia Iran in a diabolical conspiracy to destroy this authentic community of believers called the Islamic State. Now, what we have seen in the jihadi movement is more extremist interpretations of takfir. Takfir is the capacity to expiate someone from the faith, to excommunicate someone from Islam. And theologically, this is very, very narrow and very rarely used, if at all. What jihadis have done progressively to advance their political project is they have given takfir, the capacity to excommunicate, an infinitely elastic quality in which entire groups of people, the Shia, the Druze, the Alawites, are excommunicated. Excommunication is necessary in order to legitimate violence against fellow Muslims. If they're really not Muslims, then the old theological prohibition about intrafratricidal killing can no longer be the case. And so both takfir and jihad have this kind of elastic quality, and they have become progressively aggressive. Now we'll go to jihad. When Muslims think of jihad, they normally think of greater jihad, the struggle with one's faith, an internal reckoning with one's beliefs. There is also lesser jihad, defensive holy war. What the jihadis have done is they have made lesser jihad greater jihad. And they have made what was a defensive war doctrine an aggressive offensive doctrine of military engagement. And as we'll see in the next presentation, Ibn Taymiyyah, the Syrian medieval cleric, is often cited as a legitimating source for both takfir and jihad. Next slide. What we see, historically, jihadis have fought three enemies. They have fought the near enemy, Muslim apostates. They have fought the far enemy, typically the West, but any non-Muslim civilization. And they have fought the sectarian other, typically the so-called deviant sects, the Alawites, the Shia, the Druze. And what we find in the Islamic State is the development of a total war doctrine that has declared war against the near enemy, the far enemy, and the sectarian other. Right? Adani, O Allah, support us against America and its allies of the Jews, Crusaders, Rafida, atheist groups, fronts, and apostate factions, and against the Alawites and their allies. Again, this diabolical conspiracy aimed at destroying the Islamic State. Adani views himself as a prophet. He views himself as a divine emissary that while he may fail, his successors will succeed because Allah will will it. We will conquer your Rome, break your crosses, and enslave your women. By permission of Allah, the Exalted, this is his promise to us. He is glorified, and he does not fail in his promise. If we do not reach it in that time, then our children and grandchildren will reach it, and they will sell your sons and slaves at the slave market. One of the controversies associated with the Islamic State is its restoration of slavery, particularly the practice of sexual slavery applied to Yazidi women, in which women are sold on slave markets. And they see this as a means to restore an authentic caliphate, since slavery was practiced by Muhammad and his four righteous successors. One of the interesting ironies of the Islamic State and its conflicts with Al-Qaeda, because it evolves out of the Al-Qaeda movement. In fact, Al-Qaeda expels it in February of 2014, is that it has reactivated Al-Qaeda's long dormant far enemy strategy. The far enemy strategy, as far as bin Laden and Zawahiri's articulation of it, that lays the basis for the 9/11 attacks, is to strike the U.S. homeland, force the Americans out of the Middle East in order to pave the way for successful jihadi rebellions. And the quote that I'm going to read you is the quote that everybody who studied Adani will cite, because it is prophetic. It is uttered in September of 2014, and we can link this quote to Islamic State supporters' killing of Westerners. If you kill a disbelieving American or European, especially the spiteful and filthy French, or an Australian, or a Canadian, or any other disbelievers from the disbelievers waging war, and including the citizens of the country that entered into a coalition against the Islamic State, then rely on Allah and kill him in any manner or way, however it may be. Smash his head with a rock, or slaughter him with a knife, and run over him with your car. Right? We can link this quote to vehicle attacks in Stockholm, in Berlin, in Barcelona, in New York, in Nice. Since this quote, there have been repeated attacks on Westerners and using knives. There have not, however, been any rock attacks. That's probably going to come next. Next slide. Now, I'm going to give you the full-scale dimension of the Islamic State's assault against the West. You had over 100 plots and 51 successful attacks since 2014. Over 400 dead. 2,000 wounded. And whom is being targeted? Civilians, soft targets. People in bars, in restaurants, listening to musical concerts, people in train stations, in the metro, in football stadiums, the so-called soft targets. What about the means that are used? Explosives, gunfire, knives, vehicles, and axes. Again, no rocks. This has been very difficult to deter because the attacks are multiple and they are unpredictable. And what makes this frightening is the fact that at least 5,000 Europeans have served in the ranks of the Islamic State. And as the caliphate unravels, and its history, the transnational jihadi state in Iraq and Syria is finished. It has been eviscerated. Where are these people going to go? They may return. And some of them may very well give up the jihadist cause. Many will not. Right? I'm going to run through some of the more notorious attacks that have the imprimatur of Islamic State. Paris, November 2015. 3 teams of assassins trained in Islamic State terror camps engaged in a series of attacks on November 13, 2015, outside a football stadium, targeting restaurants and bars, and targeting a music concert. 130 dead. Brussels, the metro and airport are attacked. 32 people dead. Nice, a jihadi sympathizer driving a huge truck kills 86 people. Barcelona in August 2017, a jihadi assaults the famous Boulevard Las Ramblas, killing 14 people with a van. What makes the Islamic State strategy so difficult is that it comes in 4 attack forms. Directed operations, Paris and Brussels. Virtual direction, ISIS cyber planners virtually goad their supporters into attacking Westerners. Most of the attacks, however, have been associated with ideological appeals that have incited ISIS supporters into violence. And you can link vehicle attacks in Nice, Berlin, and Barcelona. And this is a peculiarly American phenomenon, the idea of lone wolves and homegrown terrorists that have multiple jihadi sympathies. They navigate between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. They really can't make distinctions between the two. They just go with the strongest. And that's true of the San Bernardino assault. And this was very much of an anomalous assault because it was done by a husband-wife jihadi team that killed 14 people at a Christmas party. And of course, Omar Mateen, ISIS sympathizer, who kills 49 people in a gay nightclub in Orlando. And what this speaks of, if you look at who's being targeted, Christmas parties, gay nightclubs, is a kind of cultural xenophobia against the West. I'm going to end it with this quote, because we now know that the transnational project is finished. Look at Raqqa. Raqqa was supposedly its new Medina. It is now, it looks like Dresden after the war. It is smoke and ash and rubble. What happens after the caliphate? And here, Adnani foreshadows his own death. This statement was made in May of 2016. And really, he's foreshadowing not only his own death in August of 2016, but the potential death of the Islamic State. But he remains defiant and he remains resilient. Would you be victorious if you kill Ashishani, Abu Bakr, Abu Zad, Abu Amir? No, indeed, victory is the defeat of one's opponent. Or do you, O America, consider defeat to be the loss of a city and the loss of land? Were we defeated when we lost cities in Iraq and were in the desert without any city or land? And would we be defeated and you victorious if you were to take Mosul or Sirte or Raqqa or even all of the cities and we were to return to our initial condition? Certainly not. True defeat is the loss of willpower and the desire to fight. The end of the jihadi state in Iraq and Syria is important. It is an important milestone. It does not mean the end of the movement. And thus the resilience suggests a forever war. And this is a war that we're just going to have to used to be engaged in. We don't like to hear that. We want wars to end. But this is unlikely to end. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you to ASU and the Bays and Chaplain AJ for organizing this evening. I've been told that I had spoken too long this afternoon, so I will somehow start with my conclusion. What I'm interested in is how are we going to deal with the post-Islamic State ideology, which is the base of the Islamic State and is still there, has not been defeated. You can get rid of a tumor, a cancerous tumor in an organism, then generally the cancer spreads and develops into metastasis. That's the situation that we have today. And the spiritual cancer of Islam, which is terrorism, is still there. And so this spiritual cancer is often based, as has been alluded to by Dr. Celso, on the teachings of a Syrian theologian, Muslim theologian and mufti, who died in Damascus in jail in 1328, called Ibn Taymiyyah. And that Ibn Taymiyyah is very, very often used as a justification during the 20th century in different Islamist movements and today in the 21st century by organizations like the Islamic State. How do we deal with that? The thing that should be not done is to imagine that Islamic mysticism, Sufism, could be used as an antidote against the poison of terrorism. It is often done in Western countries, as in Islamic countries. You have seen authorities giving a red carpet treatment to Sufi sheikhs. Those are the good Muslims, the compatible Muslims, supposedly, and we should encourage their understanding of Islam as a counter-narrative to terrorism. It does not work. The only way to deal with this ideology is to go from a theological and jurisprudential point of view deeper into the texts which those guys claim to follow, to show them that their understanding of those texts is wrong, or that there are other texts by the same authors whom they use as their justification. That's exactly the opposite of what is said in the text which they use. Meaning, we have to face them with more knowledge than the one they claim they have of the classical sources which they use. And it means that if you want to get rid of this spiritual cancer, offering them as an antidote some kind of mystical spiritual diabetes, too sugary to be really representing the middle way of Islam, will not work. But it is what has been done. For example, in this Mardin conference that met in this southeastern city of Turkey in 2010, when a number of Muslim scholars met and came with a new declaration, supposedly a new Mardin fatwa, in reference to a fatwa that Ibn Taymiyyah himself had written about that city at the beginning of the 14th century. And in this new Mardin declaration, those scholars said things like, it is the responsibility of the community's religious scholars to condemn all forms of violent attempts to change or violent protest within or outside Muslim societies. Notice, all forms. It's an absolute statement recognizing no exception. The main consequence of that new declaration could be found on internet when Islamist websites started publishing works like this one, The Conference of Mardin and the Scandals of the Criminals. The criminals being, in this case, the scholars who had met in Mardin. And the whole thing became an American affair when Anwar el-Awlaki, an American citizen who was an Islamist militant leader in Yemen, wrote his own refutation of the New Mardin Declaration and said, among other things, that this declaration calls for a blanket condemnation of all forms of violence attempt to change or violent protests within or outside Muslim societies. This might be the way of Gandhi or Martin Luther King, but it is not the way of Islam. And he adds, Islam does recognizing changing through force, and that is what fighting in the way of God today Today, we cannot expect Palestine, Iraq, or Afghanistan to be freed again except by force. Another absolute statement accepting no possible exception, which means that the absolutism of the New Mardin Declaration, condemning all forms of use of violence, triggered nothing else than another absolute statement on the other side of the spectrum. So somehow, in this case, a declaration that was, you could say, too sugary to represent properly the middle way of Islam, triggered its own opposite at the other extreme of the spectrum. Spiritual diabetes triggered spiritual cancer. And that is exactly what should not be done, because you can trust the Islamists to do their homework, to revisit traditional, classical texts of great Muslim thinkers like Ibn Taymiyyah and others to justify their terrorism. If you come to refute them with general statements like, oh, this goes against the spirit of Islam, that will not do. Those guys want proofs. Those guys want you to go back to the text and come with the same type of textual proofs that they claim themselves to be using to justify their actions. And of course, one of the main texts that you have to revisit is what has been called the three anti-Mongol fatwas by Ibn Taymiyyah. And those are three fatwas written by this scholar, Ibn Taymiyyah, at the beginning of the 14th century to stir up resistance against a Mongol invader that was threatening the Mamluk Sultanate of Syria in Egypt. You can find them in the 28th volume of his collection of fatwas in those pages. Those three fatwas try to convince Muslims that they have to resist an invader. And how does Ibn Taymiyyah proceed? In 3 steps. He says those Mongols who are threatening Syria claim to have converted to Islam in 1295. In fact, they are not real Muslims. Why? Because they still follow the great law of Genghis Khan rather than following the Sharia. So they are not real Muslims. So we have to fight. 3 steps. You are not following the Sharia, so you are not real Muslims, so we have to fight you. And those 3 Mongol fatwas are the most widely used classical text in all forms of Islamism during the 20th century. You will find them used by Abdeslam Faraj, an Egyptian electrician who is behind the assassination of President Sadat in 1981. You find those 3 same anti-Mongol fatwas of Ibn Taymiyyah used in Algeria during the civil war in the work of the number 2 of the Islamic Front Salvation, Ali Belhaj, in his work Fasl al-Kalam fi Muwajahat Zulm al-Hukam, so the decisive treatise concerning facing the injustice of the government. You find those same 3 fatwas used by Osama bin Laden, and you find them in the journal Dabit that Professor Celso was speaking about. But the mistake would then be to consider that it is exactly the same use which is made of those 3 anti-Mongol fatwas in all those different Islamist publications or movements, and that would be a mistake, because Islamism is of more than one color. And for example, you will see that Abdeslam Faraj compares the Muslim rulers of Egypt to the Mongols, saying that they do not follow the Sharia, but rather imported legislations, just as the Mongols were following the great law of Genghis Khan, despite claiming to be Muslims, rather than following the Sharia. And so the Abdeslam Faraj was assimilating Sadat to the Mongols, meaning we have there a Mongolizing form of Islam. They say, no, the Mongols are not threatening the city, the Muslim city from outside, they are ruling it, forgetting that loyalty to your own rulers is one of the bases of Islamic political theology. And those fatwas had been written by Ibn Taymiyyah against an invader, whereas Ibn Taymiyyah was always the most faithful subject of the Mamluk sultans who were ruling Syria and Egypt, where he lived, and who in fact were ethnically Mongols themselves, and in their form of government, they were not really better than the Mongols who were invading in Egypt. But Ibn Taymiyyah always remained faithful, loyal to them. And so, to assimilate Muslim rulers to invading Mongols is one of the main mistakes of Islamist literature in the 20th century. But as I told you, they don't all commit that mistake. And for example, this Islamist, Osama bin Laden, didn't fall into that misunderstanding of Ibn Taymiyyah's 3 anti-Mongol fatwas. For him, it's not the Saudi royal family that was the Mongols of his time. And he followed the same 3 steps approach of Ibn Taymiyyah. You, King Fahd, you don't rule according to the Sharia, so you are not really a Muslim. You would expect as a 3rd step, we'll fight you. No, please, can you give your resignation? And for 10 years, Osama bin Laden remained totally faithful, loyal to the royal Saudi family, never calling for any kind of armed rebellion against the Saudi royal family. So you have Islamists and Islamists. People like Abdeslam Faraj in Egypt or Ali Belhaj in Algeria were, from this point of view, more radical than Osama bin Laden. Or, if you want to say it, and please don't make me say what I don't say, don't misunderstand me, I'm not praising Osama bin Laden, I'm just saying that he had more knowledge of the guy he was claiming to quote, Ibn Taymiyyah, than the Egyptian or the Algerian Islamists who were also quoting the same anti-Mongol fatwas. Which means we have to go to that level of details if we want to understand how those Islamist brains operate. And when we come then to the new kids on the blog, which are those guys, Abdel Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the so-called Islamic State, etc., and see how they operate. One of their most famous and atrocious videos was the video of the burning of this Jordanian pilot Muaz al-Qasasbeh in January 2015. I will not go into the details. They quote in the middle of their video a phrase by Ibn Taymiyyah. And very interesting, of course, for the historian of text. The first thing that we noticed was that they had gone for a wrong manuscript tradition. You know that manuscripts, people copy by hand a text which they have received, produce another copy of it, and by doing so they make mistakes. And Arabic gives you the opportunity of very quick but extremely important mistakes, just by putting dots above or under some letters in a different way. And in the quote by this Islamic State video, you have sha'i, which means public. In fact, the more authentic, correct version in the manuscripts that we have of that text, and also in the editions, is sa'ir, permissible. And they went for the wrong variant, and that changed completely what Ibn Taymiyyah was saying in the text that they were using. And they totally ignored the fact that for Ibn Taymiyyah, Muslims are not allowed, theologically, canonically, they are not allowed to retaliate against bombardments or types of weapons that are used against them if in their canonical arsenal they do not have that same type of weapons. And punishing by fire is something which in Islam canonically is not permissible. And so burning that pilot was something that was totally unacceptable, illegitimate from a theological and canonical point of view in Islam. But as those guys didn't understand the text that they were quoting the text in a mistaken version, of course they made a complete mess of it. If you want to counteract, refute them, that's the level of technicalities that you have to go into. Hey guys, the text you quote, you didn't quote the authentic version, and you didn't understand half of it. In fact, to be patient, when you do not have, canonically speaking, the possibility of using the same weapons as your enemies, you better be patient, you cannot retaliate. Of course, they didn't understand anything of that. And when we look then at their literature, mostly Arabic, and that journal, I had the opportunity to look at the 11 first issues at the time when I did that study, the 11 first issues of that journal, to see how many times do they quote Ibn Taymiyyah and what are the occurrence of Ibn Taymiyyah in those 11 first issues. And as you see, it's quoted quite often. So I enjoyed myself identifying all those quotes in the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah because they didn't give all the references as they should have done academically speaking. And for most of their quotes of Ibn Taymiyyah, I could come with another text by Ibn Taymiyyah that would say something else, or the opposite. It's typically the case with what is said in the issue number 10 about fighting the Shiites. Which for them is a necessity, an obligation, supposedly, as said by Ibn Taymiyyah. At the time I was looking at this, I had just translated, into French, a language in which I'm still working sometimes, a fatwa by Ibn Taymiyyah, a long fatwa about the Shi'is. And in that fatwa, I found material that was going exactly the opposite way of what was said in Dabit number 10 about fighting the Shias. And it starts by, at some point in the fatwa, by Ibn Taymiyyah saying, look at the Prophet. He had every reason to execute one of his enemies at some point, but he abstained from doing so for the simple reason that he didn't want people to say that Muhammad is killing his companions. Which means that for PR reasons, the Prophet refused to have one of his enemies executed. And that is a quote of Ibn Taymiyyah. And then Ibn Taymiyyah goes further and explains his methodology about takfir, anathematism, excommunication that Dr. Celso spoke about. And Ibn Taymiyyah explains how people have got to operate at two levels. He says, yes, what this guy does or what those people say is indeed something which is unacceptable in Islam. That's what a mufti is supposed to do. He is supposed to say what the law is about. But then there is a second level which consists in how are we going to apply that general rule to particular cases. And that second level is, of course, as important, if not more important than the first level, because now it's about implementing general rules to particular cases. And Ibn Taymiyyah explains that for all different questions, like condemning people to the fire in the hereafter, thinking that they are lost doomed, or killing them here, or calling them non-Muslims, there are two conditions to fill. One is to have all the reasons to do so, but more importantly, all the objections against doing so must have been refuted. So you have that guy saying things that are unacceptable in Islam. Yes, what he says is kufr, but it doesn't mean that the guy himself is a kafir, because you perhaps have all the reasons to consider him as an unbeliever, but have you been able to refute all the objections that there could be against calling him an unbeliever? The guy is perhaps a new Muslim. He knows nothing about his new religion. Or he was born far away, like the Mongols, in the steppes, without any access to religious education. Or he's a bit mental. He has problems of all sorts. You cannot, in that case, apply in this, or about this particular individual, the rule that you have stated in the absolute. And what do we see then? Is that, of course, the whole Islamist literature never goes to that second level, only speaks in general in the absolute, without ever referring to the necessity to fill those two conditions, have all the reasons to apply the general rule to particular case, and more importantly, refuting all the objections against applying those general rules in particular cases. Which means, and that for Ibn Taymiyyah is a general rule. It's not just a fatwa that he would have issued in particular circumstances. He says it's a general rule of the religion, and he applies it in about other people. Here he says, however, we do not judge that a particular individual enters under this general rule until comes up about him that which should demand it to be the case and against which there would be no objection. Al-muqtadi alladhi la mu'arida lah. So he uses the same methodology about the Sufi hippies of his time, about whom he is asked as well. What does that mean? It means that it is not enough to rely on the absolute statements coming from Islamism to think that this is what Islam is about. First thing, no. The second level, all the remarks that have to be taken into consideration, circumstances that have to be examined as well before applying general rules have to be taken into consideration because they're also part of the religion, more importantly than the theoretical rules. And it means that all those guys, Islamists and others, if we go to that deep level of analysis, can be easily refuted. You can always find texts that will be leading to their refutation about the Shiites, about everything, about everybody else. And that's the way we have to deal with them. We have somehow to go into the text, classical text, deeper than they themselves go, and show that they do not understand those texts, that they read them without contextualization, that their approach is biased, that their knowledge should indeed be improved. Because that's the only way to deal with them. I know it works. I don't mean it is the panacea, but I know that it works. I've had the opportunity to follow a conversation on an Islamist website at some point where a guy was coming and saying on the blog, oh, I have read this text translated by Michaud. I don't believe that Ibn Taymiyyah has written that. Another one comes into the conversation, says, no, I've checked, here is the Arabic text translated by Michaud, the translation is correct, Ibn Taymiyyah indeed wrote that. And then the first one comes back to the conversation and say, oh, I don't know what to believe about Ibn Taymiyyah anymore. Which means he has lost his certainties, he has lost what he thought was a real understanding of Islam. The worm is in the apple. Islamism will rot from inside, from this point of view, if you provide a counter-narrative coming from the people whom they themselves consider as their holy patrons. That's what I have been trying to do for the last decades, not because I'm paid to be an agent of any type of de-radicalization policy, but just out of academic interest for the truth. And it leads, if you're interested, I'm not preaching for my publications. I don't get any royalties on those books. I don't want them, but they exist. You can read them. One is in English, another one is coming in German. It's going to be published in the next few weeks. But it takes me, and I will conclude with this, to the good methodology of one of my predecessors at Hartford Seminary, Duncan Black MacDonald, who was training missionaries for the Muslim world. We have changed. We are not that type of missionary school anymore. And we have Muslim students, we educate Muslim chaplains, and we have Muslim faculty as well. But Duncan Black MacDonald was writing in 1923, I should have liked to see more emphasis laid on Arabic for those who wanted to become missionaries. And also the whole Eastern non-Christian world is theologically minded, and when our missionaries go to them with a non-theological temper of mind, they are simply unintelligible. I would say we have to be more theologically minded than ISIS if we want to defeat them ideologically. We have to fight them at their own game. You claim to speak for Islam, you claim to speak for Ibn Taymiyyah. No, look at those other texts, they go exactly the opposite way. And that hopefully will have some impact. Thank you.